Okay, so now it's time to talk about marriage. And marriage, in one form or another, exists in all societies. But the different arrangements that we see around the globe are so highly variable that it is hard to find a single definition of marriage. As an anthropologist, I always smile to myself when I hear politicians say, as part of the same-sex marriage debate, things like, quote, marriage has always been defined as a union between a man and a woman, and we can't change that now, end quote. Marriage in our society might have always been defined in that way, although even that could be debated. But in truth, there are more societies in the world that allow more than two people in a marriage than societies that limit marriage to a man and a woman. So in order to come up with a definition of marriage that is applicable across most cultures, we use a very broad definition. So marriage, at its most basic, is a socially defined relationship that defines rights of access to sex, parentage, enculturation of children, and economic production. You may have never really thought about marriage in this way, but it is a definition that is true even for our own society. Once you are married to someone, that is the only person who you're supposed to have sex with, and that is the person with whom you have a shared responsibility in raising a child, and more right to how that child is raised than someone outside of the marriage has. And you have a right to share in your husband or wife's income or labor. So a man who gives all of his money to his sister while his wife is wearing rags, or the woman who doesn't work outside the home but doesn't cook or clean or take care of the kids for her husband, is seen as a bad husband or wife. And in fact, they are violating their partner's basic rights of marriage. So this week, what I want to do is make a few comments to enhance what the book has to say about marriage. Let's start with thinking about marriage in our culture. In our culture, we think of or construct marriage as being a personal choice made by two people, mostly having to do with romantic love, sex, and friendship. And this very much reflects our egocentric concept of personhood in general. Many, though, if not most societies, see marriage very differently. They see it as a relationship established between two groups of kin and not just the couple. Marriages are often negotiated by the families of the bride and the groom. The couple may or may not have much say. Often the bride and groom can make suggestions about potential partners that the families take as starting points for negotiation, and sometimes they can veto suggestions made by their families. In some societies, the families can make arrangements before the bride or groom are even born, such as the case of the Jew Hoansi in Africa. The families typically negotiate exchanges of goods and or labor between the groups, or make choices based on political alliances, or make choices based on how the marriage will affect the social status of the families. So then the kin groups then have obligations towards each other, obligations to raise the children, rights to the labor of one or both spouses and or the children, obligation to replace a spouse if he or she dies too soon. So if a wife dies, her relatives may actually be obliged to provide a replacement wife, typically the deceased wife's sister if there's one available. This practice is called the sororate. If a husband dies, his relatives may be obligated to provide a replacement husband, typically the deceased husband's brother, if he's available. And this is the practice of the levirate. These practices can salvage the complex economic, political, and social commitments that were negotiated between the two families. So if a man dies right after his wedding binds the two families together, it makes sense for his brother to step in and replace him. Why blow a crucial once-in-a-generation deal just because a young person died? And who has a social identity that's more like a young man than his brother, who has exactly the same family relationships as the deceased groom? And when you think about all of that, that reflects a more socioeconomic concept of personhood, in which your identity and your behavior depend crucially on your position in social networks, especially of your kin. So it's still very much integrated in culture, no matter which type of marriage we are looking at. So then let's look briefly at rules of mate selection. Who can actually marry whom? Incest is prohibited in all societies, except in special cases like within some royal families, Egyptian pharaohs, and so on, but these really are exceptions to the rule. It is one of the few, so this idea of incest is one of the few apparent universals in human culture. But specifically, which relatives are considered too close to marry varies, and that's what makes this interesting. Some societies see first cousins, so parents, siblings, kids, as too close, thus incestuous. Other societies see cousins as the ideal marriage partners, not too close to marry, but not strangers either, still well within the trusted circle of well-connected relatives. So, for example, many Americans think that first cousin marriage is not only repugnant, but also dangerous. Americans generally think that cousins risk having children with genetic disorders. In actuality, just to give you a little bit of trivia, the genetic risk of first cousin marriage is pretty small. A 2002 meta-study found that first cousin marriages have a 1.7 to 2.8% higher risk of producing children with genetic disorders than do marriages of non-relatives. But this is part of how we construct our ideas of marriage and incest. We are using supposedly medical, but really unfounded, beliefs to rationalize an essentially arbitrary cultural construct. And if you look at this map, first cousin marriage is legal in about half of the U.S. states. It's fully allowed in quite a few states, including California. And it's limited, meaning it requires counseling before approval or only allowed for older couples and so on, in another group of states, and then it's fully not allowed in a few states. No other Western country prohibits first cousin marriage. So again, culturally constructed. And then here's an extreme example of a cultural construction of the incest rules. The Lakher or Mara of Mizoram and easternmost India. They are extremely patrilineal. So a child is actually not considered related to its mother's relatives at all. So if a boy's mother divorces, remarries, and has a daughter with a different man, the two children of the same mother are not related through any male relative, which means they are not related at all. So they can technically marry. We would absolutely consider that incest between half-siblings, but because of their extreme patrilineality, they don't see those two as siblings in any way, shape, or form. So the point of this is, even though incest seems to be a cultural universal, it's culturally constructed. So we can say all cultures have incest, but what we can't say is what those incest rules look like. And then let's talk about some of the other rules. So your book defines exogamy and endogamy and really adequately discusses what they are. But I just want to add to the discussion a little bit regarding the social rules of these practices. So endogamy, meaning marriage within a group, is commonly done by subcultures that feel threatened by larger society as a way to keep their culture alive and vibrant. If people marry outside the group, their cultural traditions and ethnic identity may become diluted in the larger society. So strict rules of endogamy are ways of keeping ethnic and cultural identities distinct. An example would be the Rom, or as they are commonly known, the Gypsies. There are about 8 to 10 million Rom in Europe, and most concentrated in Eastern Europe. And they don't actually claim any national identity, but they move around Europe, and their only loyalty being to their own people. They probably came to Europe from northern India in the Middle Ages, possibly even earlier, but they haven't really blended with European populations or picked up many European traits. They still speak a language that's closely related to the languages of India, and they practice a non-Christian religion of very ancient origins. They also maintain clothing and food styles that are very unique in Europe. And this long-term cultural preservation has been achieved in part through very, very strict endogamy rules. If a Rom should marry a non-Rom, they must leave the group and are expected to break ties with their families. And for this reason, very few people marry outside the group. Imagine what it would be like to break ties with your family. So endogamy preserves cultural identity of a subgroup and creates a sense of group solidarity within them. It can also keep resources from leaving a group, like land or money. So if the rich only marry the rich, their money remains concentrated and doesn't end up leaving the upper class circles. Endogamy also reduces genetic diversity, which may or may not be a problem. Exogamy, meaning marriage outside a group, increases both biological and cultural diversity in a group. So it can be used to create social links between groups, like political alliances, or relationships between villages that can support each other in the case of a natural disaster, for example. Among the Hopi Indians, exogamy was sometimes used to relieve population pressure. When a village's agricultural land was strained by high populations, exogamous rules would come into effect that required some members of the group to marry into other villages or even other Indian tribes like the Navajo. Only the daughter who was to inherit the land and house was allowed to marry within the village. Another social role of exogamy can be to blend a subgroup into a larger population. For whatever reason, a subgroup may not want to remain distinct, and allowing or even demanding exogamy increases the blending into the larger group. An example would be the history of Japanese Americans. Prior to World War II, Japanese Americans were largely endogamous and often wrote to family or friends in Japan to arrange a marriage, so they didn't marry outside their ethnic group. After the harsh experience of World War II, where Japanese Americans were stigmatized and many lost their land and money when they were sent to internment camps, many Japanese began to downplay their Japanese traditions and emphasize instead their identity as Americans. So endogamy relaxed, and most married outside of the Japanese community in the baby boomer generation. So ironically, though, many of that generation are now trying to reconnect with Japanese roots and rediscover the Japanese identity that their parents steered them away from. The next topic I want to talk about is the relative status of women under various different marriage forms. So polygamy, multiple wives to one man, is often associated with high status for polygamous women, or for women in polygamy situations. And this comes as a surprise to many Americans because they don't equate multiple wives this way. They equate them with being a man's sex slaves or property, and an idea that has been created by Hollywood portrayals of polygamy. In truth, when women are highly valued and are considered to be productive economic forces in a household, polygamy is more common. In addition, in societies where a woman leaves her birth household and joins her husband's household, a woman may become isolated from the people who have always been her support network. But in a polygamous household, a woman enters a built-in support network, because the group of wives may all create a support group. With multiple wives, you have people to talk to, work with, help with childcare, and should your husband mistreat you, a group of people who have a vested interest in supporting your cause. There have been cases where an African man might beat or mistreat a wife when he comes home drunk, and his other wives band together to protect or defend her. The entire group of women may withhold their labor or sexual contact until he has offered retribution. Polyandry, on the other hand, is more often associated with low status for women. In a polyandrous household, a woman has virtually no support network, and she is often doing the household work for multiple men without other wives to help or to offer childcare while she works. Where the multiple husbands or brothers, as in fraternal polyandry, the most common form, the men are a unit and the wife is an outsider, so she has less chance of standing against them if she disagrees with something. When we talk about bride service and bride wealth, these are also associated with high status for women. A woman is seen as an economic asset, and therefore the birth family must be compensated if a woman is to be taken from their family to become part of her husband's family. To the contrary, dowry is traditionally associated with low status for women. It is intended to compensate a man for having to take the burden of a woman into his household. Dowry may also serve as a woman's security net. If she is to go too far from her birth home to live with her husband, and he can only access her dowry as long as she is with him and treated well, it is an incentive to him to treat her well. Dowry may often contain goods that help a woman set up her new household, the things that she needs that are her things that help her run the house. Our tradition of a bride's family paying for the wedding and our tradition of wedding gifts come from these idea of dowry. So those are the main things I really wanted to add about marriage. I don't have a whole lot else to add. Your book really does do a nice job with this, but I do want to make these notes that these are terms at a minimum you should know about marriage. As with kinship, there are a lot of other terms to know, but these are the ones that will definitely at least get you to a point of understanding and through the exam. And as always, shoot me an email if you have any questions.